Hello, my lovely pupils, it's Jijimaherie, and today we have another episode of Jiji's College Dropout Film School. So today we're going to be talking about the latter half of David Lynch's career, most notably Lost Highway, The Straight Story, Mulholland Drive, and Inland Empire. So I did make the first half of this video, so if you're looking for some of his earlier works, those are going to be in the first part that's already uploaded. And if you're thinking about Twin Peaks, I'm going to make another video about that at a later point, at some point. But yeah, so don't ask me about where those are. They're going to be there. The Twin Peaks one is coming. Yeah, Elephant Man, Eraserhead, Dune, Blue Velvet. Those are all going to be in the first video. And Wild at Heart. So if you were looking for those, that video is already uploaded. Also, spoiler alert. There's gonna be spoilers. Just warning you now. Just be prepared for it. So if you want to watch any of those before you watch this video, do that now. Yeah. Anyways, so let's get started. So the movie follows a guy who basically starts receiving a bunch of videotapes that are unmarked of him and his wife. And basically he gets convicted of murder. And then in prison, his body is like swapped out with another guy who is played by one of the Gettys, or the more specifically the child of John Paul Getty III. If you don't know who that is, he has a very crazy story. He was a guy who orchestrated his own kidnapping and then got his ear cut off, and if you don't know anything about it, I implore you to look it up because it's very weird. And I was like, oh my god, that's his son is the guy that basically is switched out with Bill Pullman's character. So he basically gets swapped out with him, and he's released because they're like, who is this guy that's in the cell that we had the main guy's character in? And then basically he falls in love with a woman who looks exactly like Bill Pullman's character's wife. And then it's a very, I'm not explaining it that well, but essentially it's a story of swapped identity, split personality type stories. It's something that's very common in David Lynch's movies, especially in the latter half of his movies. We'll talk more about some of those concepts in the upcoming later in the video. But essentially, I would say, and there's a lot of interpretations about what it is. A lot of people have said, oh, is this about reincarnation? Is this about, the cycle of repeating the same thing over and over again? There's been a lot of that analysis. Another interesting analysis that I had seen was that Patricia Arquette, who plays the dual role of the wife as well as the woman that the second character, Peter, falls in love with, she basically said that she believed that it was a story about misogyny, and about men having an intense hatred / love for the women in their life. She described her own interpretation as, to me, it's sort of a movie about looking at women through the eyes of a misogynist. So he's totally obsessed with her, can't love her enough, can't have her to himself, can't kill her enough times. She later elaborated, he hates women, he doesn't quite trust her, even though she is his wife. He kills her and can't remember it. Then he recreates himself as this virile young man and meets her again. And now she actually wants to fuck him and she is in love with him. But even in this version, she is a dirty whore. In this man's mind, a woman is always the monster, no matter what. Which I guess is an interesting analogy, that he's just destined to repeat the cycle of obsession and love and violence, which I think speaks to a lot of the way that people view relationships and each other, which I think is quite fascinating. When he was asked about whether Pullman's character is caught in a time loop, he answered with, "He's trapped in this time loop, doomed to repeat his murders and mistakes forever and ever." Well, maybe not forever and ever, but you can see how it would be a struggle. Yeah, that's it. And he basically compared it to Buddhist conception of reincarnation, elaborating that it's a fragment of the story. It's not so much a circle as like a spiral that comes around, the next loop a little bit higher than the one that precedes it. There's also been interpretations that people have stated that they thought that it was more of a psychotic break and not so much like a time loop, which I think is also an interesting theory and probably plays more into a less surreal version of how you want to interpret that movie. But it's quite fascinating to think about it in that sense. People can make that context about split personalities and what that would entail. But I think it's quite fascinating to have that as a more realistic aspect of that interpretation. I think that that would be a great way to talk about it in terms of like a realistic interpretation of that movie if we're ignoring the time loop stuff. But I think again, David Lynch very much has always said with all of his movies that he wants it to be open to interpretation and to not answer exactly what he meant when he made it. Okay, so the next movie is The Straight Story. The movie is about a man by the name of Alvin Straight who drove 240 miles to visit his brother who had suffered a stroke on a lawnmower or a tractor mower, like a John Deere type tractor mower. This, I would say, is probably the most straightforward of his movies in terms of like not having like surrealist tendencies. It doesn't have any surrealist elements to it. It's a very like plot straightforward movie. It's also based on a true story. There was an actual guy who drove 240 miles on like a tractor, and it's kind of like the movie is very like sweet, and it's a very specific it feels more like I'm watching like a more like family, like I guess a more straightforward like sentimental. This movie was released in the 90s, so it feels like very sentimental with like I wouldn't put it at the same level as like Forrest Gump or like I don't know. Like it feels like it's that kind of feel, like it's a very Steven Spielberg-esque feeling in terms of how the way that it presents itself. It doesn't really feel like a David Lynch movie, which I'm not hating on it. I would say if you're going into that movie expecting like David Lynch surrealist vibes, it's not going to feel like that. But it is like, I guess if you enjoy that kind of stuff, that would be interesting to you. It stars Richard Farnsworth and Sissy Spacek. And you know, it wasn't my it's not particularly my favorite. I would probably say it's, of all of his films, it's probably my least favorite, but it's not like a bad movie. Like it's just a specific type of thing that I personally wouldn't gravitate towards as much. If I wasn't doing this video, I probably wouldn't have watched it or felt gravitated to watch it as much. But you know, it's a well done movie, and I respect it for what it is. Mulholland Drive, which is another movie that features split personalities. It stars Naomi Watts and Laura Herring. So the plot follows an aspiring actress played by Naomi Watts who basically arrives in Los Angeles, and she befriends a woman with amnesia who broke into her apartment. she just was, it wasn't her apartment, it was her aunt's apartment, but she just breaks in to like randomly because she doesn't know who she is or where she is or why. So basically halfway through the movie kind of flips itself on its head and everything is kind of inverse. In the second half of the movie, instead of her being a woman with amnesia that Naomi Watts' character just randomly meets, that is her ex. Naomi Watts's character is not as successful. Rita, who is not Rita in the second half of the movie, is essentially like more successful than she is. She's dating a Hollywood director, played by Justin Thoreau. I don't know why I was having trouble saying that. Thoreau. So basically, it ends with the Naomi Watts' character putting a hit out on Laura Herring's character. Basically, the entire first half of the movie, a lot of people interpret it as being like a dream, and essentially she's just imagining that she's more successful and that she has more control over her ex, when in reality she does not have any control over her ex, and she basically is dreaming about this as a way to like make up for the fact that she put a hit out on her girlfriend Camille. Yeah, I think I enjoyed it. It is also one of those other stories where David Lynch is really into the concept of swapped identities or split identities, split personalities. I found it to be a pretty interesting, concept. And I would say it's probably like my top 3 of all of his movies. Naomi Watts was quoted as saying, "I thought Diane was the real character and that Betty was the person she wanted to be and had dreamed up. Rita is the damsel in distress and she's in an absolute need of Betty, and Betty controls her as if she were a doll. Rita is Betty's fantasy of who she wants Camilla to be." Michael Wilmington of the Chicago Tribune quoted it as saying, "Everything in Mulholland Drive is a nightmare. It's a portrayal of the golden age." Michael Wilmington of the Chicago Tribune quoted it as saying, "An Inland Empire." Inland Empire, I feel like, is the hardest movie to describe. And it's also the last film that he ever made, which was in 2006. I know he worked on, obviously, Twin Peaks and stuff, and he was working on other things. The whole thing with Netflix where they, like, wouldn't allow him to make the movie that he wanted is kind of bullshit, in my opinion. But yeah, I think it was the last feature film that he had ever made, which is kind of unfortunate that he couldn't, fulfill his opportunity to want to make more, unfortunately. So this film is also probably the hardest to explain. It's very like fragmented in how the plot is. Basically follows a Hollywood actress played by Laura Dern, who essentially begins to take on the personality of her character that she's playing. And it's basically in like a cursed film that she's starring in. So her character, who goes by the name of Nikki, is married to this guy who is a Polish man. There's a lot of Polish people in this movie specifically. And a lot of, I believe it was actually shot partially in Poland. But basically, she is cast in this movie that is cursed, or allegedly cursed, because they had attempted to make it previously. But basically, the movie that she's cast in is supposed to be a remaking of a film that was cursed. And the first time the movie was attempted to be made, both of the main actors ended up dead inside the story, which, again, I think is something that is a complicated way to describe it. There's a lot of SW people in this movie. There's a plot of a woman attempting to kill her with a screwdriver. At some point, the character that she is married to switches, but it's played by the same actor. Like, he goes by a different name. There's a lot of stuff in this movie. And I don't want to say that I didn't like it, but I think of all of his movies, I think this is probably one of the harder ones to like pinpoint, for me at least. I would say this movie is probably one of the ones that I would say would be, I felt like was the hardest to interpret, or like I feel like when I ended up not watching it, I was like, I don't fully know what I feel about the movie personally. Again, David Lynch is somebody who's very like, he wants his movies to be left up to interpretation. The only thing that he basically said about it in terms of like what he answered was, it's about a woman in trouble and it's a mystery, and that's all I want to say about it. Which, go off, I guess. Like, yeah, that checks out. That it's like, but it also, I think I walked away from this movie feeling confused more than anything else. New York Film Festival Richard Pena summarized the film as a plotless collection of snippets that explores themes Lynch has been working on for years, including a Hollywood story about a young actress who gets a part in a film that might be cursed, a story about the smuggling of women from Eastern Europe, and an abstract story about a family of people with rabbit heads sitting around in a living room. There's also is a whole like section of the film that involves her watching like a show where it's just anthropomorphic rabbits. There's this thing called Rabbits that he had filmed in 2008, and it had been released after this movie had been made, but it's like a short horror segments that involve these rabbits as well. And I would just say that it definitely felt a little bit disjointed. Not in a bad sense, it's just more like this was the one that I felt the most confused by. Alright, so that's all I have for today. Next video is going to be about Twin Peaks, which I'm going to have to binge watch that, which that's going to be fun, because I've never watched Twin Peaks in its entirety. I saw like the first episode of it, but I'm excited to do that. So anyways, comment down below which of these films was your favorite. And yeah, like, hit subscribe, all that cool stuff, and I will see you next video.